Good evening, if we could come to order. Welcome, councillors, officers, no members of the public present with us this evening, but those that might be joining us through the webcast. Welcome to this meeting of Strategic Planning, Sustainability and Transportation Committee, today Tuesday the 7th of February 2017. The usual housekeeping. We're not expecting a fire alarm this evening, but if it does sound, please remain seated. Mrs. Matthews to my right will ascertain the situation and give further instructions on the evacuation of the building if appropriate. And to remind you that today's proceedings will be webcast by the Council, but if anyone else is intending to record these proceedings, can you please let me know now? I ask this question not to stop you, but merely to ensure that members and other members of the public in the room may know that this is taking place. And I see that nobody is indicating. Thank you. Moving immediately to agenda item 1, apologies. I see that we have a full house tonight, so no apologies. Therefore, item 2, no notification of substitute members. And at item 3, I would like to advise you all that there are 2 sets of urgent updates in front of you on the desk. One relating to agenda item 16, which is the bus station options appraisal, and the other relating to agenda item 18, which is the consultation response for the Medway local plan. When we draw closer to those items, I shall allow you some time to just read those papers if you so wish, if you haven't done already. But I have agreed to accept those as urgent papers. At agenda item 4, I will take a note now of visiting members, and I see that we have Councillor Perry and Councillor Round. Do you wish to speak on any items?
No, I shan't cause any trouble tonight. So, agenda item 15, that's all I'm interested in as an observer.
Okay.
Thank you.
And that's the same for you, Councillor Round. Thank you. Next, I'll take disclosures by members and officers. Are there any disclosures, please? I see that no one's indicating, so I'll take that as a definite no. And I'll move to item 6, disclosures of lobbying. Are there any disclosures for lobbying, please? Councillor Mrs. Prendergast.
Agenda item 15, I've been lobbied on.
Thank you, and that's duly noted. I see no others. Councillor English.
I was lobbied by Councillor Willis in relation to item 16.
Again, that is duly noted. I can next move to the minutes of the meeting held on the 10th of January 2017, circulated with tonight's agendas. I trust that you've all had an opportunity to peruse those, and therefore I ask you, may I sign those as a correct and accurate copy? Is that agreed? Thank you. Agenda item 8, I can inform you that there are no petitions to be presented this evening, and it's a similar scenario for agenda item 9. There are no questions from members of the public. Agenda item 10, we will consider whether any items should be taken in private because of the possible disclosure of exempt information. We have no yellow papers in front of us this evening, therefore I propose at this stage everything can be in public session. Is that agreed? Thank you. And now to agenda item 11, which is the committee work programme. Again, that is on your papers. It's fairly compact, so I do believe we have it on the screen if that assists you to read it more carefully. It really is just for information only, but you will see that there is much ahead of us in the remainder of, or in this new year, perhaps we should be saying. I would also like to draw your attention to the fact that last meeting we did ask you to reserve an additional date in your diary, but the way the work programme is currently structured, that date is not required. So you can put a pencil line through that one if you wish. Agenda item 12, some of us represent this committee in different capacity at various outside bodies or other occasions, and this is an opportunity just to receive feedback from those that do so. Besides myself, is there anyone that needs to update the committee of their activity?
No, Mr. Chairman, due to the holiday period, there have been very few meetings.
Very good, thank you. So just quickly to inform you, as you're aware, that I was asked by this committee to be involved in consultation with the progress on the gyratory system and the towpath, and I've had a number of meetings with officers to verify emerging detail there. And I was also asked to represent this committee at the strategic board in relation to development at Maidstone East. I can tell you that there was a one-day master planning workshop, which has been used to create a brief to put a scope to consultants for further work on planning the site in a holistic manner alongside the station development. So I attended that, and in a personal capacity but related to this committee, I also attended a Westminster Forum briefing on intelligent mobility, which was a very interesting glimpse at the future of transport. And when the proceedings of that conference are issued, I will, if they are feasible to email, share those all with you. I think we can next move to our first real item of business, agenda item 13. This is the strategic plan performance update, quarter 3. May I be reminded which officer is going to start us on this?
Anna Collier.
Thank you. Can I hand over to you then?
With pleasure. Evening, members. As you know, the quarterly performance update is presented every quarter. It monitors progress of the strategic plan, and members are asked to note the performance of those indicators, strategies and plans pertinent to this committee. Progress for this quarter continues to be positive across all indicators and strategies, though there are a couple of points of note. The processing of major planning applications on page 21 has dropped slightly since last quarter, but if you look at the profile for last year, this follows the same trend, and the direction of travel is still improved both against the quarter 3 target and against last year's performance. And this is the same position for the number of affordable homes delivered on page 22. The more observant of you may notice that there has been an additional surprise indicator included on page 23, which is not relevant for this committee, but has been included for your interest anyway, or was an error. As you are aware, we came to committee previously to discuss the update of the strategic plan. Just to remind you that it's being recommended to PNR that across all committees we review the key performance indicators for the next financial year with members in March. And I'll happily take any questions.
I see we have one indication. Councillor Mrs Springett.
Yeah, probably going to totally show my ignorance here. I do apologise. What do the quarters relate to month-wise? Are they from April? Are they from January? Because it doesn't actually say. And I just wonder, I was trying to explain the second quarter, the drop in the school journeys thing, and I wonder whether it related either to the summer period or to over the winter when it's cold and wet. So could you just give us an idea of when those quarters run from?
Yeah, I mean, if you're not used to it, it is financial year, so it runs from April. The data we collect for the number of school journeys, which would have been for quarter two, that data is not our data. We collect it from a third party. I would make an assumption, not knowing a tremendous amount about that data, that some of it will relate to holidays, but it comes from a third party, so it depends very much on, and they are reliant on the schools giving them that information as well.
Thank you. It's just purely ignorance. I wasn't sure how it worked. Thank you.
Okay, I see there are no other questions. Councillor Mrs Prendergast.
Sorry, again, perhaps looking for sort of more clarification on processing of major planning applications in 13 weeks. There's a note at the bottom that says that officers have been successful in negotiating an extension of time over the 13-week period. What percentage of those applications, the major applications, have an extension of time? I'm curious to know. Thank you.
Mr Jarman, are you able to give us a feel of an answer there?
I can't give you an exact percentage, but it's likely to be high because of Section 106 agreements.
So I am minded that one of the things that will be in front of us in the not too distant future, once the strategic plan is agreed, we will be reviewing which KPIs we shall look at in the future. This evening we're just asked to note what is in front of us. We are also asked to identify if there are any particular actions that need to be taken based on what we've seen. Given that there haven't been questions to that effect, I think it would be fair to say that we're satisfied. So on this occasion, may I ask that we note the report as presented? Is that noted? Thank you. We'll move to page 24 now. This is the third quarter budget monitoring report, and if I could pass over to the officer to run us through that, please.
Yes. Good evening. This is the third quarter budget monitoring report. It provides the committee with an update on the financial position up to the end of the third quarter of this financial year. So for the council as a whole, we're continuing to forecast an overspend, although this has reduced from the second quarter as a consequence of actions taken during the year to control spending. So for the council as a whole, we're now forecasting an overspend of 288,000, which is reduced from 445,000, which we reported to you at the end of quarter two. So for this committee only, you're actually showing a favourable variance of 42,000 as at the end of December. And that's a continuation of the position we've reported to you previously. Within that figure, there are some larger variances each way. They're detailed within the report, but just to draw out the two kind of most significant ones. Development management, we've reported to you previously that there's been an overspend on agency costs, which hadn't been met by income received. Steps have been taken to address the issue, and as a result, the forecast variance of 300,000, which we reported to you at the end of quarter two, is now reduced to 212,000. There's also continues to be a large underspend within pay and display parking, which again we've reported to you previously, and this is expected to reach 247,000 by the year end. Appendix A to the report provides kind of detailed information across all areas, and I'm happy to take any questions.
Thank you. That's very concise. Councillor English.
Two questions. In terms of the variance on development management, that's the second quarter ending. Is it anticipated that the variance will continue to decline, or is that, or will it remain roughly at that level? That's the first question. Mr. Jarman.
Mr. Jarman, I think probably your remit.
Yeah, there was.
Councillor English, if you could do your microphone.
There was always going to be an overspend because there's a zero budget, as I've said before, for agency staff. But down to brass tacks, the number of agency staff, as it's termed, has gone down from 7 to 1. So the variance is going down all the time.
Thank you. And secondly, you may or may not recall, I raised with Mr. Green at the previous discussion on the budget, the amount of income forecast for street naming and numbering. Just to observe that, again, this is outperforming the forecast revenue. I know that it is a bit of how long is a piece of string with this, but I just want to point that out because it might be relevant to decisions later down the road in relation to budgeting. I wouldn't want to suggest that we increase it by 20,000, but I would suggest that we may have been a bit cautious.
I think it's very reasonable to note what you've just suggested. Personally, I'm reluctant to increase the budget forecast because by its very nature, it is so unpredictable. I think the report generally is a mixture of some very good news and some elements that require our further concern. Personally, I think our recommendation to Policy and Resources regarding budget contributions is reiterated by this report as being a sound one. The realism of being able to go from quite a significant overspend in planning costs to a scenario where we were being asked to support budget cuts, a budget that we'd exceeded by so much. I do think our recommendation back to P&R was a good one. It would be very interesting to see what they make of that. Councillor English, I think you want to add further?
Well, it will probably be premature for this budget cycle, but I do think we have to bear in mind that we will need, as an authority, if the housing white paper becomes a reality, to make some decisions which will bear directly on the amount of income that the authority can achieve, and which would have an effect on that, on not necessarily the budget estimates, because obviously we would have to decide those in advance of when the white paper gets enacted or not, but going forward. And you will be aware, Mr. Chairman, of some of the things that came up with the Air Quality Monitoring Workings Group that, if legal, could have an impact on the parking budget, which would need to be looked into.
You've just reminded us both that we should have mentioned attendance to the Air Quality Working Group earlier on.
I was going to bring it up under the bus station.
Yes. So, anyway, that's noted for that earlier item. And you make a very good point. The white paper has got a lot to be unravelled by way of implication to this council generally. So we'll have to watch and see how that evolves over the next few weeks.
Well, I think, Mr. Chairman, I was urging that we don't just watch and see, but we actually, get ahead of the game and try and work out the implication.
Which I think is why I said next few weeks, not months and years to see, the next few weeks, and some of the early impact coming in as early as the 1st of April, I think. So, members, we are... Councillor Wiggenden.
Thank you very much, Chairman. Just briefly to know that when we're looking at the car parking and the positive variance we have here, the pay and display car parks being 30% or so above what's budgeted, it does show the very strong demand above what was expected that we're seeing in the car parks in the centre of town.
Good observation. Members, we're just asked to note the revenue position at the end of this third quarter. Is that noted? Thank you. We're at agenda item 15. This is the report concerning the inspector's interim findings for our local plan. Ms. Anderson.
Good evening, councillors. This report presents to you formally the inspector's interim findings that were received on the 22nd of December and which I know were circulated to councillors before Christmas. Overall, the interim findings represent good progress. The inspector has endorsed key aspects of the plan, which is very much to be welcomed. But also it's clear that he makes clear that his findings aren't comprehensive at this stage, and indeed they're not final. So at this stage, the committee's been asked simply to note the findings in his interim report. Looking forward, the next meeting of this committee on the 14th of March, the committee will be asked to consider a report on the proposed main modifications to the local plan. Just to provide some background to that, at the start of the examination process, we wrote formally to the inspector and asked that if he thought it was necessary, that he should recommend to us any changes that were needed to the plan in order for him to be able to find the plan sound. As the examination hearings have progressed, that schedule of proposed main modifications has been collated. And at the latest hearing into the local plan exam, which was held on the 24th of January, a couple of weeks ago, the inspector indicated that he required public consultation on that schedule of proposed main modifications. And they also will require sustainability appraisal as well. Again, for clarity, at the stage of public consultation on the main modifications, it's only the modifications that are being consulted upon, so it's not a chance for people to reopen the debate on other aspects of the plan, maybe aspects that they're still not content with. It's very much focused just on the main modifications. And the responses that are received during what will be a 6-week consultation period will then be passed direct to the inspector, who will take those into account before he reaches his final conclusions on the plan. He does have the option at that stage, once he's seen the consultation responses and maybe thought about matters a bit more, to actually request that more hearings are held. And so that is an option open to him. And as has already been mentioned, we've had the housing white paper issued today, and the inspector did indicate at the last hearing that depending on the content of that, and whether that has implications for our local plan as it stands at this advanced stage, that may also be a factor which he may want to have greater thought and discussion about, and potentially at a hearing. But clearly we're entirely in his hands in that respect. Subject to working on the assumption for now that there isn't a need for any more hearings, the inspector indicated that we should get his final report and recommendations in June, probably late June. And then the next step after that, to get us to an adopted local plan, would be that revised local plan with incorporating the changes recommended by the inspector coming again to this committee before, all being well, a recommendation to full council. Thank you.
Councillor Mrs Springett first, then I'll move clockwise around the room.
I've got two questions, actually. One is my favourite topic, the 5-year land supply. On page 36, 2.22, it says that the interim findings are reflected in the inspector's recommended modifications. And it says, following public consultation on the modifications, if confirmed, the revised 1st of April 16 position would be 6.11 years. I get that, but does that actually make any difference if his report isn't coming out till June? Because we should have an April 17 5-year figure by then. And actually, what are the implications of that if we've been using an incorrect figure for a year? Is my first question.
What we've done, and colleagues have prepared specific text that will go into the consideration of planning application committee reports. What that 6.11 figure represents is if, on the assumption that all his recommendations do get through the final testing process through the modifications, that is what our 1st of April 2016 housing land supply figure would have been. It's clearly relevant because it reflects the inspector's consideration that we've had so far. And also just to underline that even preceding that interim findings, we were stating that we had a 5-year land supply. All this, what his interim findings have given us is a strengthened position. But you are also exactly right, is that we will do a completely updated housing land supply position dated at 1st of April 2017, which will be new survey information as well as taking account what the inspectors recommended in terms of how that supply should be calculated. But as at this point in time, this figure is relevant because it reflects the inspectors' findings.
Out of interest, with where there's a planning appeal, I'm thinking of somewhere like Bearsted Golf Course, which is greenfield land, and another one it's not in my ward, they're actually in Nick's ward, where there's a planning appeal. Will that have any bearing on a appeal going at the moment? Just out of curiosity, those that are currently underway.
What development management colleagues are ensuring is that for appeals that are running currently, or perhaps even where the hearing might have been held but the decision hasn't been issued yet, that the relevant inspector is being informed of the interim findings and the fact that it's positive for the council's position on housing land supply, and this revised figure as well, which again shows numerically a strengthened position. So it is being brought to the attention of relevant inspectors.
Thank you. I've got one more question, and I'll let someone else have a go.
Can I just see if Mr. Jarman wants to further contribute to that line?
Yes, it's a very important point. What we said at the examination was on the 1st of April 2016, we had a 5.12, I think, supply of housing land. And obviously we evidenced it. It's not just the sites, it was based on phone calls with developers and agents as to how many would be built out in the first year, how many in the second year, how many in the third year, that sort of thing. And obviously we debated that in a lot of detail in this chamber, but we have evidenced that on the 1st of April 2016, we had a 5-year land supply. If I may, just to help the inspector, what we did in between the 1st of April and I think the end of August 2016 is we did a refresh, whereby obviously we'd granted planning permissions subsequent to the 1st of April 2016. So we produced that refresh, but it wasn't comprehensive, because what we didn't do is go around and count up the number of houses. Yeah, and a lot of developers said, oh, you shouldn't have done that because it's not a comprehensive picture. So we said it's the best we can do, and all we're trying to do is be helpful for Mr. Miller. The key paragraph for me of the interim findings, which, again, to be blunt, the house builders don't like, is paragraph 98, whereby Mr. Miller says two things. He uses the term strengthening. So what was in front of him was 5.12 years. And then, as Sarah said, he then alludes to the 6 point something. And one of the main reasons he does that is because there's two ways of doing a housing trajectory. There's either the Sedgefield methodology, which gives you a spike, and some people, including Mr. Miller, saying is unrealistic because the house building industry has never been able to produce that many houses so quickly. Or you go for more of a flat line, what's called the Liverpool methodology. And he went with a sort of hybrid, but it was more towards the Liverpool. But by going to the Liverpool, it improved, it strengthened our 5-year land supply. Now, you'll probably hear at appeals, and I'm sure this cropped up at Fant Farm, that, you know, agents, etc., will say, oh, Mr. Mellor didn't have all the facts in front of him and they're only interim findings and things like that. But we will say, we demonstrated at a public examination that on the 1st of April, we had 5.12 housing land supply.
And I've heard it said that amongst planning circles, this is now known as the Maidstone method. So...
Could I just quickly come back on my other point, and then I'll let someone else speak? And this was actually the same page at 2.26. It's just the inspector concluded that delivery of sustainable transport measures is of great importance. I get that, but as we are not the authority that deals with the buses, and we have no control over buses, how are we going to take that forward?
Mr. Jarman again.
Thank you.
I'm sure some people would disagree with this, but in planning there's what's called Wednesbury rules of, tests of what's reasonable. And in very simple terms, if an infrastructure provider, whomever it is, let's pick on Southern Water, gets X amount of money to improve, say, a wastewater treatment works, based on the Wednesbury tests of reasonableness, why wouldn't they want to improve the wastewater treatment works? So what the inspector's doing, and it's continuing, is looking at why an infrastructure provider appears to not want to improve that particular infrastructure.
Councillor Wiggenden, were you wanting to continue in that same thread before I move around the room? Yes?
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. I just wanted to go back to that, the land supply. Actually, it's very welcome that we're now looking at a 7-ish year supply now. And we talked about that a number of times through last year. I remember we had the discussion when you said, we do this once a year in April, and that's done. And we actually made the points, who says it's once a year? We wanted it to be more up to date, and indeed you did that, and that was great. I then go back to the planning meeting we had at Barty Farm, and the officer said, this council's position is that the housing land supply was 5.12. Now that's okay, but he repeated it, and because it kept being brought up by a number of speakers, he mentioned it a number of times to the committee. You must understand this council's position is that land supply is 5.1. So, if we have that position, who has taken it, on whose authority, and if we have a position, what is our official position now? Because when we had that planning application, we definitely had a very firm position, because he said it about 5 or 6 times. It's not specific about that application. What I'm asking about is, do we have a formal position on what it is at this point, and who makes that choice?
Mr. Jarman, is that something you can answer? I mean, what I believe is you're saying that the Spatial Planning Development Control Team are actually issuing an advice to Development Control to assist in applications and appeals. Is that what we're saying?
Yes, as Ms. Anderton said, I mean, basically, certainly at appeals, what we're saying is 2 things. One sort of more important than the other. What we're saying is on the 1st of April 2016, we have 5.12 years of land supply. So we're over the line. We don't really have to say more than that, but as I said, to help the inspector at the examination, we did this refresh, which doesn't take into account numbers of completions from 1st of April 2016 to the end of August 2016. And that shows something like 6.11, something like that. But it's not a full refresh because we haven't included the actual completions.
Can I move on, Councillor Wigginen? Not quite, but I'll move on.
Established that this council does not have a formal position, and therefore an officer should not be saying it in a planning meeting.
I think there's a question being asked. Is it? I'll come back to you. Is that something that we can answer in a direct manner?
Yes, the formal position is on the 1st of April 2016 we had a 5.12 year supply of housing.
Okay, I think nothing further needs to be said, and I shall move on. Councillor Mortimer.
Thank you. The barracks site, there's moves afoot to try and get the MOD's decision to close it in the long term sort of thing. Now, I know it's up for review in 2020, as Mr Mellor put in his findings, but I mean, and my position is as well, I know the MOD normally take these decisions and they're normally long term and they normally stay like that. But how do we stand if the MOD change their mind in the short term? And then, because I can see that when this site's coming forward towards the end of the local plan, there won't be enough room in the urban area of Maidstone. We will be looking at larger villages on possibly building on the Leeds-Langley bypass. So, do you see what I'm saying? What is the position on this? It's a bit hypothetical, but it could happen.
As one councillor to another, can I put an answer to that? Any landowner could withdraw their land at any time on any site that's included. It's no different. Mr Jarman, do you want to add anything further?
Only that we argued that the site in Victor Barracks would come forward earlier 2026, but the inspector rejected that and just stuck exactly to what Michael Fallon said and said no, earliest 2027.
The reason I asked it is I was worried that we were going to be 500 short at some stage and we would have to be looking somewhere else. So.
Councillor English.
Yeah, well, we should be beware of trying to unpick something that's already gone to the examination in public and rethinking our position here. And we should be wary of, for whatever reason, including possibly political reasons, of trying to get officers to admit to assertions which could be quite damaging to this council's position. We have had a very bizarre appeal decision recently, and which I won't go into for obvious reasons, but clearly we should be beware of causing ourselves additional problems at this stage in the process. I would ask members to wait for the schedule of modifications to come forward before having a substantive discussion on these issues, because we are at a delicate stage in these processes, and frankly it would be very easy, given all the people who want to sink this process, for us to score own goals.
I do accept what you're saying, but I don't think it undermines the fundamental right of councillors to ask questions to gain clarity. And if we did stray into areas where your concerns were most acute, then I would rely upon legal officers or otherwise to advise us to consider a Part 2 scenario. Okay? But point well made. Do you have anything further to add, or may I?
Yes, I just want to make an observation that I actually, when I was a very junior planning employee of Canterbury City Council, I actually carried out an actual refresh of this type. And I assure you that it is literally is the best picked snapshot we can get in these circumstances. And I tell you from the practical experience of having done one.
Thank you. Again, we are simply asked to note the inspector's interim. Further question, Councillor, Mrs. Prendergast.
Sorry, I just want to come back on Councillor Springett's point. She asked about transport and the inspector talking about the delivery of sustainable transport, and he highlights buses in particular. And I know the answer came from Mr. Jarman, which was very much focused on the infrastructure providers, and I do understand about the Wednesbury Principle, etc. What I want is some assurance that the service providers, that the buses, the bus companies are on board, and we can look forward to an improved and increased bus service, and that there are no surprises we won't see. We need that reassurance to know that this is going to work. Mr.
Jarman or Mr. Thompson?
Sorry, Ms Thompson might want to chip in, but yes, to the extent that a big bus operator actually supported us in the examination. In fact, they were sitting next to us. Yeah. Well, no, they were saying the opposite, that they want to get on with it, quite frankly.
Final comment, Councillor English, and then I'll consider moving on.
I was going to discuss this under the bus station where it seemed more appropriate, but I can say, unfortunately, you weren't able to attend on this occasion, Councillor Prendergast, but we had both New Venture and Arriva at the last Air Quality Working Group, and I've never seen them so enthusiastic as to wanting to get on with things. I've never seen it before, and it is amazing the sort of change in mood that we've seen from both of them.
Very good. So as I was about to say, we're asked to note the inspector's interim findings. I think it was also important to gather an understanding of the next stage, which will be our next meeting, to consider the next stage of public consultation, and that is not a Regulation 19 consultation, it's a 20-something, I think, and that those findings will go directly to the inspector. And I do think it's an opportune moment actually to give some recognition to the success that Mr. Jarman and his team have had in bringing the local plan to this stage of certainty. We're not over the final hurdle, but I think we should congratulate them for an excellent job thus far. So perhaps you'll agree with me and note the report accordingly. Is that agreed? Thank you. Agenda item 16, I'm going to ask Mr. Egerton to run through the bus station options appraisal.
Thank you, Chairman, and just to remind members that there is an urgent update associated
Can I
with
just
this.
chip in and say, have you all had chance to read that A4 page, or would you like a moment? Everybody nodding? Yes, we've had sufficient time. Please continue.
Thank you, Chairman. Officers and transport consultants have been asked by the Director of Regeneration and Place to undertake a high-level scoping exercise of options to improve bus interchange facilities in the borough, with a focus on Maidstone bus station. The request aligns with Maidstone's draft local plan, as well as the adopted integrated transport strategy. This initial scoping exercise set out in the report is the first step in a process which seeks to establish a preferred option with the following initial aims: to improve the bus interchange facilities in Maidstone, including the bus station itself, improve air quality and reduce noise pollution, improve the quality of bus services in Maidstone, increase bus patronage, improve ease of movement for buses and support the growth of the town. If agreed by members, a more detailed study would look at potential future bus hubs and improvements to the existing bus network. It would not necessarily seek to replace the existing bus station, but consider a range of sites which could be suitable for some sort of interchange facility, whether this be a full station or small cluster of bus stops or bus hubs. Potential sites would therefore need to fulfil one or more services and functions in order to either act as a single resource for bus operation or as part of a wider network of sites. A range of service options and functionalities for each potential site has been drawn up, and they are provided on page 77 of this agenda in the report itself. And a number of assumptions have also been drawn up which could also inform the more detailed study if agreed and inform discussions with stakeholders, and they are also provided on page 77. Following specialist transport planning input, an initial 12 sites have been considered for bus interchange facilities. These have been subject to a high-level assessment based on, and this is provided in the report on pages 78 and 79, and based on the results of the initial high-level appraisal, further analysis of the following sites are recommended as part of the study, and they are Maidstone Bus Station, the Mall, Maidstone East Station for short-term purposes, Maidstone East Station and Royal Mail depot redevelopment, King Street on Street, the Broadway Centre and Sittingbourne Road Park and Ride site. Importantly, though, further investigation of potential sites will also take place as part of any study which is agreed tonight, and the above does not represent a definitive list. It is proposed that the study would initially take forward the above aims, service options and functionalities for potential sites, assumptions, assessment criteria and the sites themselves. If the committee instruct officers to produce the further study, it is proposed to undertake detailed scoping, for example, sites and nature of sites, and the generation of preferred options. And this will include discussion with Kent County Council, Arriva, Capital and Regional plus other stakeholders as well. It is proposed to present the findings of this exercise to the Strategic Planning, Sustainability and Transportation Committee with further recommendations. Now, as noted at the beginning, there is an urgent update associated with this, and in addition to the work which I've mentioned, in accordance with the urgent update, consideration has also been given to the production of a parking strategy for Maidstone Town Centre. The Maidstone Town Centre parking strategy also aligns with the integrated transport strategy, with Action P3 seeking to optimise the level of parking space provision in the town centre. And this would allow for consideration of what measures might be introduced to encourage long-stay parking into the larger edge-of-centre car parks and to establish whether there is any scope for rationalisation of existing provision. At the same time, work is also due to take place around the future park and ride provision in Maidstone. This also aligns with the adopted integrated transport strategy, which seeks to undertake a full and independent review of Maidstone's park and ride provision and issue and act on recommendations by 2017. So all three studies would address similar cross-cutting themes and require specialist transport input. Accordingly, it is proposed to consider these matters concurrently, and whilst initial work would take place on the bus station options appraisal, it is proposed to bring a report to the 14th of March SPST, providing further details around the scope and content of the parking strategy and park and ride study. In the meantime, an amendment is proposed to this report, which would allow this to continue, but it would allow all three studies to be considered together. And so the recommendations for this report now read, firstly, to consider the initial findings of the high-level options appraisal. Secondly, proposed to instruct officers to undertake a study to investigate preferred options to improve bus interchange facilities within the borough, with a view to incorporating future work on the Maidstone Town Centre parking strategy and park and ride study, subject to future agreement of this committee, and to agree to consider a future report to the committee once an options appraisal has been undertaken and the preferred options have been identified. Thank you.
Thank you. I would urge members at this stage to try and keep comments at a fairly high strategic level to give guidance to how these options and these further studies will move forwards without getting into minutiae at this stage. And I shall start with Councillor Mrs Grigg and then work anti-clockwise.
Thank you, Chairman. I'm much relieved when I've seen this urgent update because I do believe that these three things go hand in hand. However, my question really is more on a resourcing decision. I can see, honestly, on page 80, we've looked at 3.3 and 3.4. The second option is to instruct Maidstone Borough Council officers to lead a study to investigate, and then if that is chosen, we go on to maybe take on a consultant. Is that not duplication of job, for one thing? And also, what are our resources to be able to achieve this? Who's going to be heading up, or is it going to be necessary for us to look for a transport manager? I mean, the ITS is an integral part of our plan, and I just want to make sure that this is a job that's going to be prioritised.
Mr Jarman, can you comment?
The detail on finances, Councillor Grigg, is set out on page 81 in the box financial. But I can't really add to that.
Councillor English, I think.
Well, this may sound slightly odd where I'm starting from, Mr Chairman, as a town centre member, but I have to observe this isn't actually a borough strategy. It's a town centre strategy. And whilst I would agree that the priority is the town centre and not least the bus station, because Capital and Regional are actually looking at that issue as we speak, so there is some pressure of time. So I'm concerned about the time that bringing the three reports together might conclude, because I think they are best together, but what I wouldn't want to do is end up delaying something that might be happening, waiting for further reports because a consultant has to be appointed to do them. So I'm concerned about the timeline. But I would observe that one of the things that we have been, that the 6 applications, so the second 3 of the 6 applications on the Sutton Road was supposed to achieve was to improve connectivity from buses to the 3 railway stations to the south of Maidstone. Whilst this shouldn't necessarily take up the majority of the strategy, I do think that if we're looking at bus interchanges in the borough, some consideration of the interchange between bus and railway services at those 3 railway stations, which are important commuter points on a actually rather better service to London, should probably be in there somewhere. So that's part 1. Part 2, there is of course a massive overlap between the discussions that I just alluded to in terms of the air quality working group, and Mr Edgerton attended the last very productive meeting, and I just want to ask how it's envisaged that the 2 processes will interrelate, because clearly we don't want one going off in one direction and the other process going off in an entirely different direction and then having to be reconciled after the event. So I think that's question 2. And depending on the answers, I might need to come back.
Yes, thank you, Chairman. Addressing the points in turn, in terms of timing, I suppose the reassurance for Councillor English is that we are seeking to bring a report to the next SPS&T on the 14th of March. So there will be an opportunity there to understand more fully the implications of the concurrent nature of the proposal. We are committing to making a start on the bus station options appraisal before that, just initial work. But on the 14th of March, we should be in a better position to understand timing implications and how those might work synchronously. In terms of the 6 applications on Sutton Road and looking at interchange facilities, the report does seek to include interchange facilities with other modes as well, and I think it's worthwhile just to reiterate that that is one of the key intentions, and as you say, it would help that it become a borough-wide study. Yes, absolutely. As you rightly said, I was at the air quality working group, and it did come up as a prospective item there. I think that by having key members and officers attending both here, being part of any study if agreed, and also being on that air quality group will help ensure that there is a synergy between the aims and aspirations of all areas and all work streams. Thank you.
I am somewhat reassured by what the officer said about the interrelationship, but I just would like somewhere in this document to actually specifically say even just a line about the potential for interchange between the rail and bus at those southern railway stations, because it is something we have actually flagged up elsewhere in the council.
I've made a note of that for when we come to the recommendation. Perhaps we can weave multimodal into there as a background concept. Continuing anti-clockwise, Councillor Mrs Springett.
Thank you. Just picking up on what Councillor English has said, I know this is the Maidstone bus station options appraisal, so it would sort of be town-centric, but I wonder if we could have perhaps a two-tier process whereby we start off with that, and then at the second level we look at the hubs, and the hubs would then be either in the villages or at the railway stations. So whether we have a sort of hierarchy, whether that's possible to start off with the town centre and get the big bus stations sorted, and then look at where possibly the station interchanges or something else could go. I don't know, it's just a thought whether we could perhaps do it as a two-tier process to get started.
I think that makes sense in terms of the multimodal influence, but I am reminded that our public transport measures were spoken of in terms of key radial routes, which implies there needs to be a hub. So I'm not too concerned about this being completely town-centric, because it's part of the very nature of design. And I will come back to you after others have had a chance, Councillor English. Councillor De Wigan.
Firstly, I do want to welcome that this is happening. I mean, we do need to actually do something to make bus use more effective and more that it work better for people, because the way it works is not as good as it could do, and our Crampton winding road system doesn't actually lend itself to large scale bus movements either. So it actually needs a helping hand rather in the ways some other towns do not. But so I'm very pleased. I'll definitely take on what the councillor said about the better connectivity to the railway stations, indeed all of them. As I see when I'm walking to the station first thing in the morning, see an awful lot of people getting buses and jumping off at the shopping centre and herring up the road to the railway station in order to meet the first train. So, you know, we need to actually get these things to work better, and I'm just welcoming that it's starting.
Quick point from Mr Jarman.
Well, going back to your point, Chairman, and one of your points, at the high level, and picking up what Councillor English said, there were, as members know, there was a bespoke hearing on air quality, and like a lot of large towns in the southeast of England, we are exceeding both national and European thresholds. And it's nitrogen dioxide as the main pollutant in Maidstone, as it is, as I said, in lots of similar towns. And what the inspector was keying in on, and I think that's what we're trying to do tonight, but it extends beyond buses. It goes into something you've championed, Chairman, electric cars, and just improving things for cars themselves, because congestion's when they're stuck at traffic lights, particularly on inclines. So it's a blend of all these, but to my mind, and it's coming out in appeal decisions a lot now, is certainly what the planning inspectorate want to see, and I understand this was why Client Earth was successful, is that there's not enough mitigation, be it buses, be it cycling, be it walking, be it electric cars, be it improving things for cars. We must deliver on mitigation.
Right, I'll have my go now, and I'll try and sum some of this together, and then Councillor English, if I've missed anything significant that you were wanting to bring in. I do think that air pollution point is very interesting, and it was debated at the group meeting, and it's one of these counterintuitive scenarios we've got. In encouraging more buses, our air quality measures may actually outlaw some of the buses because they are such a low specification. And there's a real balancing act to be had in encouraging buses and really pursuing air quality ideals. There's something I would like us to ask officers to consider in bringing these further reports forwards, is the horizon, timescale horizon of our window, our planning window. I attended one of the KMET meetings last week, and one of the things on the agenda was county's response to the government's consultation on infrastructure requirements. And one of the things that came through very clearly in the debate is actually there's the importance of that timeline. So if you were planning, let's say, water infrastructure, quite logically, we all know we're going to need water in 50 years' time and beyond, and perhaps the infrastructure planning window should be in 10s and 50s and maybe even 100-year type thinking. When it comes perhaps to transport, there are perhaps some really different scenarios that become reality within 20 years that would not need huge pieces of infrastructure like a massive bus station. You know, we have the modern transport bill, you know, that was in the Queen's speech. The government are very committed to autonomous transport. It was an interesting observation that only in a British Parliament could somebody arrive in a horse-drawn carriage and give permission to the rest of us to consider autonomous vehicles. But that is very much foremost. So if we're looking at transport measures, are we asking officers to plan a transport solution for 10 years, 20 years, or 50 years? Because the amount of investment in infrastructure will, you know, if you don't need bus stations in 20 years' time, you don't want to take out a 50-year municipal loan to pay for it. So I think the timeline needs to be thought about. I'm very, very keen that this is taken holistically with the issue of parking and of park and ride, because I'm very minded that in these papers we're talking about using car parks for bus interchange, perhaps, but we haven't decided whether we need the car parks yet. So the two have got to go hand in hand. And I don't think there's completely even treatment here either, because we'd consider where Medway Street car park might be used, but we're not considering how King Street car park might be used. We're looking at the on-street element. And I don't want officers to go away and literally stick to the boundaries of the draft here, but consider everything. So I've mentioned the timescale, and I don't know if members want to venture a guidance to officers, or we ask officers to consider the relevance of the infrastructure planning horizon in this connection. I'll come back to you. Just make sure I've mentioned, and that the three things are considered together holistically. Now, Councillor English, I promised you a quick say if need be.
Right, Mr. Chairman, I do agree with your overall point, but the planning horizon is 2031 in this respect, isn't it? That's the horizon.
But if I could come back,
yeah, but
in terms of building significant infrastructure, we might aim to start something by 2031. You know, if we said we're going to acquire land, put bids in, we could be very close to 2031 before it even starts.
Well, maybe. But all I would say is that on this document and the related issues, and I do, yes, provided the timeline agrees, and it seems that it does, bringing them together is great. On this document, the important thing is that, as updated, we stress that this is a borough document, and I do want a specific reference to the interchange with rail. And we just say interchange with other transport systems, including rail, and i.e. the southern railway stations. But I would point out in relation to the other point that Councillor Springett made, this isn't just about the bus station, it's about hubs and lay-bys and rest points as elsewhere in the town centre as well. And the bus operators have flagged up, actually, they're as important to them as they are as the main bus station is, perhaps more so. And final point, can we stop talking about bus company? Stagecoach runs a service from Folkestone to Maidstone, and National Express runs a service, and also, not to forget, New Venture runs a lot of services in Maidstone. So can we please stop talking as if Arriva was the only bus company in Maidstone?
Yeah, I do support that last comment. I want to try and draw us to a conclusion, but I see Councillor Wiggenden has indicated, and then Councillor Mrs Grigg. So, Councillor Mrs Grigg?
Yes, thank you. Just very quickly, you asked for what members could ask to progress this. It was indicated that the next two strategies will be with us for the next meeting. As a committee, could we urge officers to ensure that that happens?
I think we'd all support that. So may I venture that the recommendation then that we should be agreeing would be something like the committee asks officers to undertake a study to investigate preferred options to improve bus interchange facilities within the borough, with a view to incorporating future work on Maidstone Town Centre parking strategy and park and ride study, with consideration to multimodal journey planning, and that this be conducted at a borough-wide level. Yeah, that's fine. Yes? If I move that from the chair, may I seek a seconder, please? Councillor Mrs Grigg, I think, was the fastest. Those in favour? That's unanimous. Thank you. Next item of business is agenda item 17. This is the Kent Minerals and Waste Local Plan Safeguarding SPD draft, and I believe Mr Thompson's going to help us here.
Thank you, Chairman. The Kent Minerals and Waste Local Plan was adopted in July last year. And one of the key elements of the plan is a suite of policies which give effect to national requirements for mineral safeguarding and minerals and waste infrastructure safeguarding. The approach taken in the Minerals and Waste Local Plan is to use the geography of potential mineral deposits identified by the British Geological Survey and to designate these areas as mineral safeguarding areas. They're shown on the screen here. Unfortunately, the key is perhaps just off the screen, but probably would be quite small. But just to indicate, the area shaded blue is identified as potential ragstone deposits. Much of the rest of the areas are sands or variants of sands. So whilst there's no presumption that these areas will ever be worked for minerals, the policies place an additional test on developers proposing, say, housing or commercial development to demonstrate that minerals present would not be needlessly sterilised by non-mineral development. For instance, due to the economic viability of the mineral, the practicality of extraction, and or the impact on the deliverability of non-mineral development. The process by which this will be demonstrated would be, in most cases, a minerals assessment, and the draft Supplementary Planning Document, or SPD, provides more detailed guidance on the procedure and information requirements involved. The urgency with which the Minerals Planning Authorities progress this document is therefore welcomed. There does remain some inconsistency, however, in respect of the proposed allocations in emerging local plans, as these are not specifically covered by the requirement for a minerals assessment in the adopted Minerals and Waste Local Plan. And this matter has indeed been subject to discussion during the examination of the Maidstone Local Plan, where council officers have argued that where there is clear evidence that mineral extraction would not be viable or practical, a requirement for a minerals assessment to be undertaken at planning application stage is not proportionate or reasonable. Overall, though, the response is generally supportive, but does seek clarification on this point, and also in respect to the details of the location of safeguarded minerals and waste infrastructure, so that this can be applied as appropriate through the development management process. Finally, councillors will note the consultation response was submitted in January, as the closing date for representations was the 30th of January. However, this afternoon, officers have corresponded with colleagues at the Minerals Planning Authority who have invited submission of late representations. So if committee is minded to amend or add to the response, which is part of the report, an updated response can be sent to the County Council for their consideration. Thanks.
Thank you, Mr Thompson. And in particular for those last comments, I think Chair and Vice Chair, together we did say to officers earlier that when consultations are inviting a response, it would, I believe, be the preference of members to have an opportunity to participate before they're sent. That wasn't the case on this occasion. We didn't actually have the December meeting. But as Mr Thompson has said, if there's anything that any of us are minded to particularly want to add to the response, colleagues at County are minded to receive it. For my own part, I'm very content with the response as draft. I see that Councillor English has indicated, so I'll go to you next.
It's not something I want to add, it's just really a question. It talks about the County Council will instead prepare specific site plans. Are we anticipating that there would be any specific site plans within Maidstone, or are we unable to?
At this stage, the County Council are out to their call for sites for minerals and waste sites. So rather like an older style local development framework, they have this core strategy and then strategic sites documents below that. And they're out for their call for sites at the moment. So we expect that there will be some consultation, perhaps at Regulation 18 equivalent, later in the year, which would be looking at specific site options. But at this stage, it's too early to say whether there would be a specific implication for Maidstone.
The reason I asked was because clearly there is potential, I think, if memory serves me right, given the previous plans of this type, Mr. Jarman will know, because much more than me, because I think he worked on one of these previously, that there were a couple of sites in sensitive locations in the AONB, and if they came forward, I'm sure that this committee would like to have an early opportunity for comment, if the timescale would permit.
I'm sure that's taken on board.
Yeah, absolutely, yeah.
I'm not seeing anybody else indicate, so can I ask that we note the response that's been sent? Is that noted? Thank you, members. We head to agenda item 18, and again I will draw your attention to the urgent update papers. You have had those by email and in hard copy earlier. Would anybody like a few moments to read those more thoroughly before we go into the item? We shall move on then, that being the case. And I'm not sure who's presenting. Mr. Thompson again. Thank you.
Thank you, Chairman. Just a bit of context, I suppose, in respect to the urgent update. This is one of those cases where fairly last minute in terms of timescales, so it was merely a skeleton report, as it were, submitted in time for publication. Then the urgent update report in front of you sort of outlines the consultation and also includes the draft response. And here the recommendation is to approve the proposed response subject to any amendments you feel are necessary. So the previous Regulation 18 consultation undertaken by Medway Council was summer last year, and it's very much a high-level, what they call issues and options consultation, not too much meat on the bone, as it were, at that stage. So the current consultation begins to crystallise development strategy options in light of the consultation responses they received, but also in terms of further technical evidence that they've undertaken, including the strategic land availability assessment. The consultation documents confirm the level of need identified through Medway's strategic housing and economic needs assessment in the order of 30,000 homes between the period 2012 and 2035, in the order of 90 hectares of employment land, in the order of 70,500 comparison retail square metres to 37, and 13,000 square metres of convenience retail to 37. So again, very, very large numbers. Four general strategy options are summarised in the report, in the urgent update report in front of you. I just briefly summarise those. Described as urgent regeneration focus, a suburban expansion focus, a new town at Who, and finally a blend of these strategies. Crucially, each of these strategies include the large development site at Lodge Hill, which will be subject to public inquiry next year, and all are designed to meet in full the identified development needs of Medway. So as a result of the nature of the consultation, the proposed response reflects the high-level nature of the documents and signposts at the moment the key potential issues, such as the impacts on transport corridors, namely the A249 and the A229. The response also reiterates our concerns made previously that the housing market area geography of Medway's assessment are not consistent with our own housing market area geography. The proposed response is supportive of the proposal to designate part of the Capstone Valley as green infrastructure, although it should be noted that some of the options consider development allocations in the northernmost part of this area. So as before, the report recommends that you approve the formal response with any amendments deemed necessary. Thanks.
Councillor English, first off the mark again.
Far be it from me to interfere in any way in Medway's plan, but let me say that observing it from outside, they've seem to have made quite a reasonable start on dealing with what is a very difficult situation for them. And so congratulations for at least at this stage. My only real concern, obviously, as a Maidstone councillor, is largely about the transport issues. It talks about have good transport connections through both rail and bus services, and we welcome further discussions on potential improvements to transport networks between Maidstone and Medway. I can't stress enough how important that really is, that we engage fully with Medway Council on that. Even if it wasn't for the Medway local plan, I've long believed that we should be trying to do more on improving our transport links between the two towns, for want of a better word. And so I hope that that isn't just warm words, and that we will be seeking to engage very fully with Medway Council on the transport issues.
I think we would all support that view.
Yeah, absolutely. Just a point of clarification, I suppose. Medway have commissioned an entirely new transport model as part of their evidence base, and we met with them earlier in the week, and they described that would be completed by the spring. So some outputs would be available then, and at the same time they are developing an infrastructure delivery plan. So again, we'll be expect to be involved in some of that, and certainly there'll be cross-border issues raised there, so numerous opportunities to get involved, I think.
Just two things I'd like to put to this. I can't resist drawing attention to the objectively assessed need. I can't remember how many times through our local plan making process it was thrown at us that 18,000, not even Medway have got a number like that. Well, now you see it in black and white, 30,000. So we've done well to get on and get through that stage, and I wish Medway every luck. But the real thing, I just wonder whether we need to bolster at all. Given our local plan inspector's comments around employment, and I think he's saying, you know, look at this slightly bigger and, you know, economic areas, and Medway, I think, are identifying just 17,000 jobs. I just wonder whether we should be making a slightly stronger, or at least using this as an opportunity to point them that at that bit of the interim report that we have, and ask them to give consideration to that.
I think this is the time to do that. Absolutely, I think we could usefully include a paragraph just signposting that. I would add that in discussion with Medway officers earlier in the week, we did raise this point specifically in terms of the functional economic market area, and the way that our inspector is looking across a broader area, but I think it would be useful to formalise that in the response.
Right, we'll try and capture that in a recommendation shortly. Councillor de Wiggendon.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I do think it's welcome that they've got on with this, and I do think it's doubly welcome that they're now saying they can contain the whole 30,000 within their boundary, which was something of a concern. I'm hoping that actually, this won't be a very serious problem on the transport for us, largely on the grounds that they are actually pretty much built up to our boundary pretty much everywhere apart from Capstone Valley. And much of this development will have to be in the north of their borough, where they've been putting through some significant infrastructure in previous years. So I'm hoping that this 30,000 isn't going to be the massive problem that actually it might be elsewhere. But I just want to welcome that they're going forward, and that's very good news.
Very good. So if I may venture from the chair, to move that this committee asks officers to send the draft consultation with an additional paragraph highlighting inspectors' comments in relation to employment need. That's it, really. May I have a seconder? Councillor English, I think you were first there. Those in favour? That's unanimous and therefore agreed. Thank you. Last item of our business this evening is agenda item 19. To be found at page 97. We are just asked to note, the plan changes in the way planning applications are provided to parish councils. So this is the transition from paper copies to relying upon electronic digital media. Do members have comments? Councillor English and then Councillor Mumford.
Is note the correct? Surely at some level in the council it is a decision to do it or
Right.
not would actually have to be made.
It is my understanding that this is a decision within delegated authority to officers. I think it's important to note that the report sets out it is the intention to move this forward in accordance with the parish charter.
Well, that was my next question.
And I am also reliably informed that there has previously been consultation around this and that it is actually the implementation of the outcome of that first round of consultation. That's my understanding. We do have an officer on hand if we have further questions, but Councillor Mumford.
Well, I did have one further question following from what you just
Well,
said.
very quickly, and then Councillor Mumford.
I just wonder whether we should consider whether the decisions that bear on the parish charter and its implementation should simply be a decision for noting, given that the document is an agreement between the borough council and another tier of local government. I actually do feel that at some level it should be a decision of a committee, not of delegation, despite the fact it's within the scheme of delegation.
I am also reliably informed that it is within our privilege to withdraw delegated power back to ourselves. That's not how how this decision is currently constructed, but we do have that ability. I would caution us before we do so. I think, Councillor, if I may, I will go to Councillor Mumford.
I remember this in 2014 when it caused such a concern. 5.1 says they carried out consultation. Haven't seen that results of that consultation. I do remember that they were going to trial it with a number of parishes. We haven't seen the results of that, and they've not been put forward with this paper. They've taken the delegated decision to do away with it. It's shortly Valentine's Day. I'm going to buy my wife a virtual box of chocolates. This whole paper that's being put in front of us says that this can be done on the IT, and it looks at its main hurdle being acceptable broadband. Well, we started to prepare ourselves for this path, and we bought a projector and a screen, etc. That is one of the parishes that I represent. You're asking 8 volunteers to come in and discuss a planning application, and you're consulting with them. Probably the parishes are the only people that get the paperwork, because the other consultees are sat in front of a computer screen and investigate it as an individual. We tried projecting the very bad broadband we had, and it did not work. So even though there is estimates of how much money would be saved, not accurate ones, there's an estimate on postage. I'm sure they could come up with that. They've been into consultation with us. They've not given us the result of that consultation, except that some parishes might have problems with broadband. And we found those 8 volunteers sat round a screen, it did not work. They want to be around a table, and they want to walk round that table, align things and point to it and discuss it. We have tried it. The parish council in Bolton-on-Chelsea will, if you complete this, have another bill. And that bill will be to go out to the printers. It will delay the consultation. They will turn the data into paper copies, which A4 just won't work. And we will be passing that bill that we sit with to the parishes. And I assure you, both Bolton-on-Chelsea, Chart Sutton, Bolton Mallow, who I've spoken to, and I suspect all the other smaller parishes, the hurdle is not broadband or the IT equipment to project it. It is the functionality of a paper plan. We shouldn't let this go forward.
I think Mr. O'Connell is beginning to get a sense of where this decision may go. Would you like me to ask him to give comment now, or would you like me to gather? Right, we'll go round. You're next then, Councillor Mrs. Grigg, and then Ryan.
I could not agree with Councillor Mumford-Moore. He's virtually said everything I was going to say. Both Bolton-on-Chelsea and Lewes Parish Council are incredibly efficient parish councils. However, I have sat at planning meeting after planning meeting with them where they have done exactly as Councillor Mumford said, and they have walked around that table. We have one laptop that the parish clerk has that constantly breaks down. I do not see how this can possibly work. They will definitely want hard copies. So I agree with everything Councillor Mumford said. I'm also very concerned with the timeline on this. If you look at 6.2, a letter would then be drafted to the parish councils, recommended changes from the 1st of April 2017. We're talking 2 months away. I mean, it's just unworkable.
Councillor Mortimer.
Thank you. I fully support Councillor Mumford, Councillor Grigg's comments. I personally don't recall the actual consultation at the time, and I don't remember I also would like to know how. I understand there's a huge saving to be made, but I have not seen the comparable costs between digital and paper. But I'm progressive. I'm fully in the digital world. I want to move it forward, but parish councils need as much support, extra support above the norm to bring this forward.
I think to do this now is quite a step in the back to the parishes. You've just asked for the preset payments. You know, we've sat down, they were late due to the NBC giving us the figures late. So a lot of us had to do extra meetings to actually get to that point, with a lot of haggling because we lost the grants as well. And to do this as well for extra IT equipment that we're going to have to buy, which we haven't budgeted for, is, you know, I can't believe it's going to even come up, to be honest. The 2 months is just unacceptable. If you are going to do it, it needs to be April of next year where we can budget for it.
Mr. O'Connell, can you assist us with any of those concerns?
Okay, there's been quite a large number of comments. So if I perhaps go back to the beginning and then work my way through. In terms of the decision and where it sits, it is a delegated operational decision to look at our processes and the way in which we print documents, but clearly we were cognizant of the fact that this impacts on parishes, who are people we work closely with, and the fact that we had the parish charter, which is why we produced the report that we have, and we've brought it here tonight. There isn't anything specific in the parish charter that says we have to print parish copies, but obviously what we've done is follow, or would look to do, is to follow the requirements within the parish charter in terms of our engagement with parishes on the change that we were making to something with them. In fact, where the requirement to consult with parishes comes from is the planning regulations, and we would be looking to consult with parishes much as we do with all the other consultees that we do, accepting, however, obviously there's been some comments made here tonight about the readiness of parishes to adapt to the change. Overall, in 2014, obviously we formed Mid-Kent Planning Support, but we also agreed jointly, then as 3 authorities, to drive forward a programme of change across planning, which was wider than just Mid-Kent Planning Support. It included the provision of a new planning system, and looking at modernising and bringing forward a more efficient planning service, which requires Mid-Kent Planning Support to work very closely with each of the DM teams in bringing forward proposals. Now, the history of the formation of the shared service, the backlogs and the issues that we had is well documented, but the service is now high performing, and we're in a position now to work with our development management colleagues to bring forward the original vision and plan that we had agreed at a tri-cabinet meeting. So that is what this is part of, and it is part of a wider series of changes that we are driving within Mid-Kent Planning Support, which means that in a few weeks' time, Mid-Kent Planning Support will be entirely paperless in terms of its operation for handling planning applications, and there will be a commensurate saving, obviously, that results from that internally for us. This is part of that programme. It's also part of a programme of delivering digital services out to the public in accordance with the government's digital services agendas, and also the Council's own stated corporate priorities on channel shift and digital services. This all aligns with doing that. This is one part of that process. Now, having said that, clearly, if there are sufficient concerns and the committee is minded, then we would naturally take those concerns on board and review the period of time over which we're doing this and the means by which we're doing it. The original consultation we carried out in 2014 was in fact for a whole raft of different things that we were going to do, whereas this is one element of that. Whilst we didn't continue with the pilots after we had significant performance issues back in 2014, those pilots are actually for a number of different things. For example, they're about parishes using the consultee portal and logging in a different way and providing comments to us in a different way. They weren't just about this particular issue. Within this report, we do recognise, in fact, in coming to the decision, we do recognise that parishes cannot be treated as a homogenous whole, because different parishes are at different standards and different levels in terms of their electronic capabilities, in terms of the number of staff they employ, in terms of their budgets. And having worked with parishes over a number of years, I'm well aware that, for example, those that attained quality status would be better prepared for this change than others, which is why we were always aiming, and still do aim, to talk to individual parishes about how we roll this out and whether there are alternatives that we can provide. For example, providing planning applications on CDs to parishes, for example, is one thing off the top of my head.
I'm going to bring Mr. Jarman in at this moment.
Yeah, I'll try and be quick. From a strategic business perspective, as Mr. O'Connell alluded to, when the decision was taken by the 3 councils to amalgamate, to create this shared service, it was always envisaged to get efficiencies, and this was one of them. This was one of the streams. As Mr. O'Connell said, it's not the only stream, but it was a a pretty critical one. And clearly, unless my maths are wrong, when you go down from 3 organisations to 2, you have less economies of scale, so even more of a need to deliver on the efficiencies.
A couple of other people lined up to speak. I would just make one observation that actually when in this chamber we determine planning applications, we rely upon the projector and the screen. But I am going to take Councillor Mrs Pendergast next.
Chairman, I think you just made the point there. When we talk about strategic business propositions, or we talk about the Mid-Kent Planning Service, you know, the mission is to be paperless, we have the resource to be able to do that, but parish councils don't. When I'm sat in Oldcombe Village Hall with residents, no internet connection and no paper copies, we simply can't function when it comes to planning.
Can I just chip in? I don't think looking at these applications on the screen is predicated on internet connection, because the file is available digitally. Is that correct, Mr.
Is that better? Yep. I mean, technically speaking, as long as you can get a digital copy of the application, so you may have to download that onto a laptop or onto a CD, or be provided it on a CD, you can then put that onto a laptop without a connection. You don't need to have continuous broadband to do that.
Can I come back to you, Mrs Pendergast?
Well, when you've got 12 or 15 residents who are, extremely worried about an application, you can't sit there with a 15-inch screen and try and gather the detail. And I just think what we are actually doing a disservice to our parish councils. It's some of the smaller ones, they either have to drive into Maidstone or Cranbrook or a similar town to try and get photocopies of it. It's a real burden, and there's clearly a lot of strong feeling around this room on this subject. And I'm beginning to think that maybe we should take that delegated authority back to this committee so we can make a decision on this.
Okay, I believe it's an option to us. Councillor Mumford?
I think the point is being missed. It's not about providing equipment to the parishes. Not unless you're going to provide them the printer and the staff time to print off A2. It is the A4 presentation that you can't stand around, touch. It is the paperless system does not work. I don't want to go to a paperless toilet. I really don't want to decide with a group of volunteers around a laptop on a critical thing like a planning application that will be forever in my parish. You are not looking at overcoming the problems, it's looking at the economics of the problem. The tool that you're offering the parishes is not one that can be used. We have projected it on a screen and they've gone back to paper. You're offering to give it to us on a CD to overcome the broadband problems. You're still back to the problem it is not a thing you can move. It's on a screen. It doesn't work. 8 volunteers giving up their time to go there, all standing round a laptop screen. No.
Councillor Mrs Grigg, then Councillor English.
The parish charter may not say that we have to do this, but we always have done it. And I remember the consultation in 2014, and I also remember the dreadful concern that it caused to my parish council. It's hard enough as it is to get volunteers to help and with the parish council, which do tremendous work. Please don't make that harder for us. You say that there's going to be individual parish councils that need help. In 2 months, you're going to be able to offer all that help in 2 months? This may well deliver efficiency in cost, but it will be detrimental to decision making. Before I
come to you, Councillor English, can I ask a little bit more about the cost? So this figure of 60 to 75,000 in the report, is that just Maidstone, or is that the entirety of MKIP?
Okay, that's a conservative estimate of the costs of printing for mid-Kent plan supports. That would be for Swale printing as well.
Okay, so if we wanted to continue to provide paper, would it be reasonable to say the cost to us is going to be about half of that? Just a rough and ready feel for numbers at this stage.
Okay. Printing estimates are notoriously difficult to pin down because clearly some of this relates to staff time, so it includes things like the time taken up to stand up from a desk, walk to the printer and back again, for example. So, as I said, it is a conservative estimate because I didn't really want to over-egg it. So it could be anything up to probably about £100,000 a year, but two-thirds of our costs are Maidstones, because of the size difference between Maidstone and Swale in terms of applications, and then a proportion of that would relate to parish copying. I mean, there are a number of options that we could explore to look to reduce printing costs, and I'm obviously more than happy to expand on what's in here and explore those over the next month or so. So, for example, with planning officers, we are looking to move to thin files, which will involve us providing plans to planning officers primarily for site visits. But we will not be printing any copies of the reports or any copies of the other documents. So we could look perhaps at alternatives, whether that's in a staged process or whether that's the end game is something that we could discuss. But perhaps if we were to provide copies of plans to parishes, we could look to do that and reduce the printing of the actual reports and other documents themselves, because there would still be a saving there.
Okay, so that's sounding like one possibility of a compromise scenario. I want to try and draw out what our actual options are this evening of how we move this forwards, but before doing that, Councillor English, do you want to add further?
Yes, I started off with a concern about the governance issue, because I think that when there is a situation which could cause real reputational damage to the members of the council and the officers, that shouldn't be a delegated decision, particularly when we've got an inter-tier arrangement between different tiers of local government, which has been signed by leading members of CALC and by the Borough Council in the past. I should know I negotiated 2 parish charters from the CALC side. And so there's a governance issue, and I think that's one thing. The second thing is, if a consultation, I'm still very unclear on this, but so I might be wrong, but I get the impression the consultation happened in 2014 on a number of issues. And now we're moving forward a couple of years later with a decision which has significant financial impact on a number of parish councils several weeks after they've actually had to put their precept in. Now, I'm not going to say that we shouldn't save on printing costs. I'm not going to say that, because I think there is an argument for saving on some of the costs, at least. What I'm saying is this isn't how the decision should be made. And frankly, it is quite unreasonable to bring forward decisions that have a financial impact on other people at such a stage that they cannot raise additional revenue because it's too late to deal with that. So we should not be doing that. It's wrong. And as I said before, and therefore I think we should be looking at the next meeting, or if that's in time, or the meeting afterwards, of all the options available, seeking to bring forward a proposal that may well reduce printing costs to some degree, but is actually done in a planned manner so parish councils can adjust.
Right, so that's sounding like a proposal from the Council of English, which, if I try and summarise it, is, and I think we'd have to say, this committee withdraws delegated power to implement this decision and therefore requests a detailed options report. And I'm going to say not the next meeting, because I want to reserve that for the modifications one, but at a future meeting. So I think that's the gist of what you were suggesting. Nobody else wants to speak, given that that is on the table, I think. Would you like to add any comment further, or?
That's perfectly fine. Absolutely happy, and I'll write a more comprehensive and detailed report than this one, which was for noting.
Okay, right. So the proposal is, and shall I just recap that? That this committee formally withdraws delegated power to make the decision to cease hard copies of plans for planning applications for parish councils, and requests a further detailed options report so that this committee can consider a decision at a later date, and that we request this be brought forward as soon as possible after the next meeting, planned meeting. I think Councillor Mumford's finger went up in the air as a second at a very early stage. Those in favour? That is unanimous and therefore carried. I believe that concludes our business for this evening. Thank you to everybody for their participation, attendance and contribution, and I declare the meeting closed.